Okay, welcome everybody. This is an amazing turnout. I think this turnout reflects the amount of passion and interest in this particular area. We are no longer referring to as gun control, but gun violence prevention. Words matter, words are important, and so it's gun violence prevention is what we all want to see. My name is Ellen Ferreira. I am the president of Democrats of the Red Rock. That is for Democrats of the Red Rock. Thank you. This is a very active organization, and I just want to give you a couple of highlights of things that are going to be happening over the next couple of hours and days. Tomorrow night, I think everybody knows, is a fundraiser and wine auction at the Elks Club, 7 p.m. It's going to be a blast. We're going to have a great time. There's lots of activities to go on, and a lot of people are registered. The food's going to be spectacular, and we've got a live band, Big Daddy D and the Dynamite. We'll be dancing the night away at the Elks Club, and that'll be terrific. On June 10th, which is a Saturday afternoon morning, 11:30 a.m. We will be having a visit from Ruben Gallego. Ruben Gallego is going to run for the Arizona Senate seat held by the formerly Democratic person here. But now simulated. Yes. Yeah. Emphasis. Okay. Ruben will be joining us. We will have refreshments. This will be at the DORR office in the breezeway right out front of the office. So we will not all be crammed into the office, but that'll be a great opportunity for us to meet him. This is a meet and greet. It is not necessarily a fundraiser, although bring your checkbook because you will be probably hit up for some donations, but that's fine. I mean, this is what he needs. Early money is very important to campaigns. So come on June the 10th at 11:30, 105 Roadrunner to meet Ruben Gallego. I wanted to pass out or distribute postcards that are addressed to Eli Crane, who is our CD2 representative in the U.S. House of Representatives. These were put together and postage has been put on these by Chris Seeholzer over here. Thank you, Chris. Tell Representative Crane what you think about gun violence prevention and how important it is and how much you object to the carnage that is going on in our communities. We don't have any script. We don't have any talking points. This has to come from your heart. They don't like things that are just one after another, same exact message. Write your own message and stick it in the mailbox and let him know there are differences of opinion. Just because this is a red Republican district doesn't mean we're all united to keep assault weapons on the street. So I will pass these out on both sides and please feel free to take one. Thank you, Chris, for doing that. You're welcome.
Pick every one of them.
Thank you so much. Comment one, she licked everyone. I'll leave a stamp, hopefully. Yes. This is the first time that the DORR educational breakfasts have addressed gun violence and gun issues. The reason being, when we thought about it, it just seemed so hopeless. It seemed like such an uphill battle. How could anything ever happen with this? And yet progress is being made little by little, thanks to groups like Moms Demand Action and March for Our Lives and the Brady Group and Giffords and a ton of other groups that are there day and day on the front, day after day on the front lines, working to see that legislation can be enacted. Public opinion and the balance of power in the political arena will determine what kind of legislation we see and where. If you look at Katie Hobbs, she's sitting in her office with her veto pen, vetoing one after another terrible bills. And that's where DORR comes in, and that's where we come in, because it's up to us to ensure that people like Katie Hobbs, all around the country as well as in this state, get elected. Because we know we want to elect people who are not satisfied with thoughts and prayers. We need more. We need action, and it has to happen. And it's got to come from political activists and regular people that are not political activists who care, electing people that do care. So no matter what poll you look at, the majority of the people support background checks and sensible gun legislation. We are the majority. They are the minority, and we have to make our voice heard. So I'm thrilled to present the two speakers that we've got today. It's going to be a fabulous program arranged by Stephen Hanks, who is our program chair. I will turn this over to him. And thanks, Steve. This is going to be a great show. And thank you all for coming and being here. And for the people that are zooming in, thanks to you.
Everybody, thank you, Ellen. I'm glad she used the word show. It makes me feel like I'm back in New York doing cabaret. Because I'm the program chair, I have the ability to do a little commentary before we start. So back in the old days when Barack Obama was president, I used to do, as I do now, a lot of political posting on Facebook, as many of us do. And I remember during his presidency, after the ACA got passed, because healthcare was like the big issue, almost every one of my Facebook posts had to do with gun violence and the mass shootings that were happening while Obama was president, culminating, it wasn't the last one, but emphasized most importantly by Sandy, which was the event that we thought would change everything. We are now more than 10 years later, and nothing has changed. Ellen brought up some statistics, but I want to get into a few more. This year, more than 100,000 Americans will be killed or suffer serious injuries from gun violence, from gunfire. And why is that? Because in 2023, the number of firearms in the United States has reached more than 40 million. With 46%, 400 million, sorry. I left out the zero when I was typing this out. With 46% of American households owning at least one firearm. According to the Gun Violence Archive, as of today, the total number of gun violence deaths from all causes this year is 16,134. There have been 227 mass shootings. And the number of children ages 0 to 17 killed is 671. Injured, 1,663. A February survey asked people whether concern over guns as a public health threat is growing in this country. 17% said yes. That same survey was taken last week, and the number was at 26%. Gun violence in America is without a doubt a public health crisis. So how many of you used to watch David Letterman when he was on? Yeah, a lot of people. So, and one of his most fun things that he would do at the beginning of the show was the top 10 list, right? So I thought not to be flip about this issue, but I thought maybe I can come up with like a top 10 list of gun laws that should be passed or repealed. And I started putting my list together, and it went to 15. And here's the list. I'll try to do it really quick with a couple of explanations. And this is in no particular order. I'm not doing like the number one at the end. 1, gun licensing and registration, without a doubt. Number 2, liability insurance for gun owners. Those are 3 things that we have for automobiles. Number 3, a 30-day waiting period before you can get a gun. Number 4, an ammunition sales database. Number 5, repeal the law that shields gun manufacturers from civil liability. Number 6, national gun ownership at 21. No more of this 18-year-old nonsense. Number 7, eliminate permitless carry and open carry laws. 8, close the bump stock loophole. Do people know what bump stocks do? Okay. They're the things you put on the gun that can make it fire more rapidly. 9, institute red flag laws, which is a gun violence prevention law that permits a state court to order the temporary removal of firearms from a person who they believe may present a danger to others or themselves. Number 10, new gun storage laws. That's something that Teresa is going to talk about. Gun owners can make their homes and communities safer and protect children and adults from unintentional shootings and gun suicides by storing their guns locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition. Number 11, eliminate the private gun sales loophole. Number 12, make the creation of ghost guns like they can do on 3D printing illegal. 13, I'm up to 13 already. Ban high-capacity magazines. 14, ban assault weapons. And the big one, 15, although it's the number 1 in my book, universal background checks. Now, I just read 15 potential laws that can be instituted and repealed, and not one infringes on anybody's Second Amendment rights. And that is a perfect segue for what I want to present to you right now. I have a special guest, although it's on film. Our special guest right now is going to be the Secretary of State of Arizona, Adrian Fontes. He did a video, that's right. He might be in the next breakfast, so you can clap for him then again. He did an amazing video when he was running that was captured by the website Midas Touch. And it was all over the internet and all over national news, where he totally eviscerates the argument about the Second Amendment. So I think we should give a watch to that, and you'll be amazed at what Adrian Fontes tells people about that amendment. Hopefully, Shelley will come through. Volume, stop. Shelley, we can't hear it.
Hey everybody, Adrian Fontes
Turn
here,
the TV
Democrat,
screen off.
Arizona Secretary of State, and I was a marksmanship instructor in the Marine Corps. I taught Marines how to shoot. Why is that important? Because I think there's a lot of people who don't understand what the Second Amendment actually means in context of the whole Constitution, right? Right, the confusion is I can just be a militia by myself, and a well-regulated militia just means what I want it to mean. That's not true. It's 100% not true. And I'm going to use this copy of the Constitution that the League of Women Voters gave me to show you why. Here's what the Second Amendment says. It's really easy. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And everybody always says, oh, well, that's great. Well, what does militia mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? Well, guess what? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16. Here's what a militia is. For those of you, especially part of the fetishizing gun weapons kind of crowd, here's what it means. Congress shall have the power to call forth the militia, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections and repel invasions. The militia, in the context of our Constitution, is enforcing the laws of the Union. They work for the government, not against some tyrannical fantasy government that you guys are fetishizing against. That's not what it's supposed to. It says so right here. It also says that the Congress shall have the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. That means you get your militia arms from the government. You don't buy them yourself. That's what the Constitution says. Then it goes on to say, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively appointment of officers. So it's a whole unit. There's discipline. They arm it. It's organized under Congress's rules, reserving to the states the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Congress provides the rules for the militia. Congress provides the arms for the militia. Congress calls up the militia. You don't just get to be a militia on your own. And if you look carefully at Heller, you can see that Scalia hedged in his free-for-all opinion. It is not a free-for-all. He hedged. He put just the right hedge in there because he knew that giving everybody a right to have any weapon they want is wrong. Well, why am I passionate about this? Why do I know about this? Not just because I'm running for Secretary of State and ran an election in Maricopa County, right here in Arizona, but because back when I was in Yuma as an active duty Marine, I was a marksmanship instructor. Digging through some stuff, I found this manual that I used to use, this giant thick manual that Marines use to train each other on how to fire weapons. Look at this thing. This is what we had to teach Marines. It's a 2-week course. Marines have to go through this every single year to be qualified to shoot with the M16A2 service rifle, which is like the AR-15. But an 18-year-old in the United States of America, an 18-year-old doesn't have to go through any of that training, can go grab an AR-15 and do damage like they've done and murder kids in classrooms like they've done, like they continue to do. It's crazy, you know, and when it comes down to it, sure, some of the Democrats have a little blame, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, but what about the Republicans like Ted Cruz that are out there blaming DORRs? What about all of the Republicans who are not standing up doing what their constituents want them to do in their own red states? The kind of regulation that we're talking about, universal background checks, banning assault weapons, these are all very, very popular, and none of the Republicans are backing any of that stuff. So you can go out there and say, oh, these two Democrats, it's all of the Republicans. They all need to get on board and do what the American public wants them to do. I'm Adrian Fontes. I'm running for Secretary of State in Arizona, and this Democrat is not going to go quietly into the night. We're going to fight and we're going to win.
All right.
I love that video. I love that video.
It's so laid back.
Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest. Our second, by this point, is probably ready to go, but he'll be after Teresa. So Teresa Nyberg, right? It's Nyberg, is works with the Moms Demand Action. Before moving to Arizona from West Virginia in 2010, Teresa was a career healthcare professional. While she had no intention of becoming involved in Arizona politics, she was motivated by the 2018 Parkland school shooting to become involved with Moms Demand Action. And she is now the organization's Arizona legislative lead activist, working with volunteers across the state to encourage our lawmakers to govern with gun safety as their top priority. I'm pleased and proud to introduce Teresa Nyberg. Teresa.
Okay, well, hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And thank you to Stephen for arranging for me to be here. You know, as Stephen mentioned, I had no idea or had no, I really didn't think I would get involved in politics or anything like Moms Demand Action. But after the Parkland shooting, my husband and I got involved, and we found out shortly after getting involved that there's much more to gun violence than school shootings. And so that was such an eye-opener for us. And then that same year in 2018, my husband and I were about to set out to do a canvass for Gun Sense candidates. And my husband received a call from his son in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, letting us know what was happening at the Tree of Light Synagogue. And we went on with our day and found out later that day that my husband's aunt was murdered there, and his cousin was the only survivor from that massacre. And so that immediately made us survivors, although it's hard to think that we are survivors, but by definition we are. And then my husband also had a niece that died by suicide with her father's unsecure gun. So, that was an eye opener for us as well. So that's those are some of the things that brought us to this movement. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here and go over a few things. And then, be willing to, let me see the screen. Okay, there we go. So just a little bit about Moms Demand Action. It was started by Shannon Watts after Sandy Hook in 2012. And as a matter of fact, we just celebrated the 10th anniversary of Moms Demand Action. And Shannon Watts is stepping down this year, and there'll be a new person taking her place by the end of this year. And because it was the 10th anniversary, Shannon Watts actually came and attended our Moms Demand Action Advocacy Day in January. So that was quite nice for all of us to be able to talk to her. And she was so gracious and let us all take pictures with her all day long. Moms Demand Action is a grassroots, nonpartisan movement for public safety measures to protect people from gun violence. We like to say we consist of mothers and others because you don't have to be a mother, just a mother to join or be a volunteer. You can, we'll accept anyone. So there's a chapter in every state and the District of Columbia. And along with Mayors Against Illegal Guns, Students Demand Action, and the Everytown Survivor Network, we make up Everytown for Gun Safety. And although we are often accused of wanting to take people's guns away, we don't really want to do that. But we support responsible gun ownership, and we advocate for keeping guns out of the wrong hands by a better background check program. We want to protect kids and communities by supporting red flag laws and responsible access to firearms, also responsible gun storage, and addressing America's uniquely lethal domestic abuse problem by disarming domestic abusers and combating daily gun violence by supporting research, law enforcement, and local solutions. As far as gun violence in Arizona has the 31st highest rate of gun violence in the United States. And we are 42nd in the US for gun law strength. Arizona is actually considered a national failure for our legislation. The current majority, and actually what I do is I'm trying to change that. So the current majority party would like to further weaken our gun laws with their Guns Everywhere agenda. Unfortunately, this year, we had Governor Katie Hobbs, who's vetoed all the bad gun bills that made it to her desk this legislative session. So I just took this information from the Arizona Public Opinion Pulse. This was conducted in July of 2022, and basically it shows that the majority of voters in Arizona, as was referenced a little earlier this morning, would like to have all the things that all of us here on this call would like to have: background checks on all gun buyers, mental health checks on gun buyers. We'd like to raise the age for assault rifles, semi-automatic rifles, or any guns to the age of 21. So as mentioned, we are the majority, but on the next slide, even though we are the majority, there were 8 gun bills that were pushed through by the majority party this legislative session and made it to Governor Hobbs' desk. And like I said, she vetoed these 8 bills. And in addition to these 8 bills, there were probably another 8 bad gun bills that didn't make it to her desk. In spite of the fact that the majority of Arizonans want better gun laws, it's not happening. And then, as we know, there were quite a few good gun bills that were introduced and went nowhere. So, it's just the majority party just wouldn't allow that to happen. Even though when we met with the legislators on our advocacy day, we talked specifically about the secure storage bill. And a lot of them said that they thought that it was a good idea and they would definitely consider it. It still didn't get a hearing. So once the 2023 state legislative session is over, what's next for us? So with it, we know that we're going to have the same legislature next year. So we're expecting a carbon copy next session, because we've seen similar bad gun bills year after year, and we've seen common sense gun legislation that goes nowhere year after year. So we are right now seeking organizations to partner with us to amplify our message to our legislators. So we're going to be working on that over this summer. So if any of you here this morning knows of organizations that are like-minded that would like to join us to amplify our message to the legislators, please let me know. Right now, every town is rolling out a Moms Demand Action candidate recruitment team. We don't have all the details on that yet, but we're asking individuals to step up and be part of this team so we can recruit gun sense candidates starting now. And then Moms Demand Action also has a program called Demand a Seat. And the enrollment will be opening for that soon for the fall cohort. And what this does is train volunteers and gun violence survivors to run for office or work on campaigns. And as a result of this program, a record-breaking 158 Moms Demand Action volunteers won elections during the 2021-2022 election cycle, which is that was all across the United States, which is amazing. And actually, there were a couple gun sense candidates that attended Demand a Seat that won here in Arizona. So if you yourself are considering running for office or know someone who is, or if you want to work on campaigns, this is an excellent program. It's free. It's an 8-week program. There's amazing resources, amazing speakers, and you have to be a Moms Demand Action volunteer to be able to participate. But in order to be a volunteer and participate, they just ask that you join our movement and then attend 2 events or do 2 things, and that will qualify you to be part of the Demand a Seat program. And I did go through that last fall, and it's not because I want to run for office, but because I wanted to understand what I'm asking people to do. So I did put a link there for information about the program. And then I also put a link there for our Moms Demand Action program, Be Smart for Kids .org, and it's called Be Smart. And the SMART is an acronym for securing your weapons, modeling safe behavior, asking before you send your children or grandchildren to someone else's home, whether they have weapons in the house and if they're secure, to recognize the role of guns in teen suicide, and to tell other people about the Be Smart program. So there is a link there for that, for obtaining more information. And also, if being part of Moms Demand Action, you can do Be Smart activities, and basically we just go around and table at events just to get the word out there about secure gun storage. And then we are also working towards getting the Be Smart program into all the schools in Arizona, so that the Be Smart information can be sent home in backpacks of children once a year. So on the federal level, right now, we're asking our senators, Mark Kelly and Kirsten Sinema, to co-sponsor the Senate bill, Senate Bill 25, which calls for the reinstatement of the assault weapons ban. Neither one of them to date have signed on to that. And then good work for having postcards already ready to go out to your U.S. representatives. Right now, we're asking them to reject the extreme attempts at undermining what's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives are trying to enforce. We're asking them to expand background checks to all gun sales. We're asking them to pass a federal extreme risk protection order law, also known as a red flag law, and to reinstate the assault weapons ban. And as a result of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022, Arizona will receive a little over $6 million. So if we had a red flag law, that money would be used for implementation and education. But since we don't have a red flag law, we will still be able to use the money for proven state and local violence and intervention programs, to support interventions such as drug, mental health, and veterans treatment courts, to support gun violence recovery courts, behavior, health deflection, and outpatient treatment centers. So we're excited that that money is coming to Arizona. The U.S. Justice Department will oversee this program, and the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission will oversee the program for Arizona. And Attorney General Chris Mays is one of the commissioners on that program. And I had the honor of attending a roundtable with Senator Sinema and Attorney Chris Mays a few weeks ago. And there was discussion about the money that was coming to Arizona. And I was able to talk with Attorney General Chris Mays to let her know that Moms Demand Action would like to be kept in the loop on what's happening with that money, because we support so many of the programs that this money can go for. So, and I added a link there if you want to learn more about that money and what's going to happen with it. And I just wanted to make note that Arizona is a Second Amendment sanctuary state that was signed into law by Governor Ducey. And that means that it prohibits state and political subdivisions from assisting in the enforcement of federal firearm laws and regulations when they're inconsistent with our state laws. And then it would also do the same thing for the counties regarding state firearm laws. And right now, Apache, La Paz, Maricopa, Mojave, and Yavapai counties are all Second Amendment sanctuary counties. And even though these laws are unconstitutional and are, they're still a threat to public safety, because in Michigan, as Governor Gretchen Whitmer is signing common sense gun legislation into law, we're seeing deep-rooted resistance to these laws playing out. So again, they're unconstitutional, but it is going to cause a problem once the federal government starts passing the laws, and if our state starts passing laws, this will come into play for us. So I want to just finish up with a picture of our Advocacy Day in January of this year. And like I said, Shannon Watts was there in the picture with us. And then also, this is the first time in the history of Moms Demand Action that we were able to have a meeting with the governor of Arizona. So, some of us got to sit down and chat with Governor Hobbs, including Representative Jen Longden and Shannon Watts. And then I'll just finish up with, in the words of our gun violence survivor and amazing gun sense champion, Representative Jennifer Longden, survivors become a family. This is the only family I know that grieves every time we grow. So again, I want to thank everyone for having me here. I am Teresa Nyberg, the Arizona Moms Legislative Lead. And that's my email there. If anyone has any questions or would like any information, I'm always available to discuss or get back to you. Okay, so I think maybe that someone has a Moms Demand Action shirt on Zoom. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's great.
Our Evans,
Great.
hello there. Thank you.
Teresa, we're going to have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Okay, I'll ask the first one. As you might have heard when we started, I went through this list of 15 different laws that we could enact or repeal, which wouldn't infringe on Second Amendment rights. Obviously, especially in Arizona, there's no way all of those things can happen. So you, as Moms Demand Action and other groups, have to prioritize what they're going to fight for. And you had that list of the first chart you showed, that survey asking people what they agree with. So given the uphill struggle that you have with a right-wing legislature here, what are you hopeful or at all confident that you could possibly get past with this kind of environment? And what are your priorities among all the different laws that we would like to see happen?
Well, going forward with this legislature, I'm not exactly sure. When we were present in the hearings, and we had Moms Demand Action folks testifying against bills, we constantly heard "thou shalt not infringe," "thou shalt not infringe" over and over again. But we're really hopeful that we can have something passed for secure storage, because that's just, everyone should secure their guns. We shouldn't depend on our children to not pick up a gun. And also mention the role guns play in teen suicide. That should not be a partisan issue. So we're really hoping that we can get something passed for secure storage. And then also right now, of course, on the federal level, we're really pushing for a ban on assault weapons, to be reinstated. And red flag laws are so important. So that's another one that we are really hopeful that we could get passed. And we would really like to have the bill passed that would have everyone have to go through background checks, no matter if you're buying at a gun store, a gun show, or online. That background checks are just so important. So those are the ones at the top of the list right now.
Anybody have a question?
I do.
Guys,
In regards to your wanting to pass red flag laws for domestic abusers, one of the largest sources of domestic abusers is police officers. How do you deal with that kind of contradiction?
That's really difficult, and we do have people in every town who are working on gun violence in that regard, because police violence is definitely gun violence. So on our very local level, we're not involved in that right now, but every town is working on that.
anybody else before we go to Zoom questions? Shelley, you can ask a couple of Zoom questions.
Yeah, I've got one, because somebody asked the same question that was just asked, so we've got one more. Has there been any partnership with various professionals who might help to have more impact, such as medical professionals, especially emergency room staff, teachers and school administrators, and dare I say law enforcement?
Well, when we had the roundtable, there were law enforcement officials were invited, and sadly, there was no representation from them. But we do work with Sheriff Penzone, and one of our volunteers in the Tucson area is a pediatrician, and so she has been in contact with pediatricians across the state and in the pediatric hospitals, and we are partnering with them to get our Be Smart program and information on secure storage into hospitals and also into doctors' offices. And like you said, we have kept track of on request to speak, we've kept track of the organizations and lobbyists who have been lobbying for good gun bills or against bad gun bills. And so over the summer, there's a group of us that's going to be reaching out to all of those people that we have a record of being responsive to the legislature.
You have another in the room? Oh, wait, 1 second. Let's go back. Tangent. You have to speak louder.
How come no one ever mentions who wrote the Second Amendment? A person wrote the Second Amendment. All people are flawed. A flawed individual, very famous in our history, wrote the Second Amendment. The reason I mention that is there's lots of people that think the Second Amendment was irrationally, divinely inspired. It wasn't divinely inspired. But people think like that. If a name was attached to the Second Amendment, it would punish the holy aura around the name Second Amendment.
Well, do you know?
James Madison.
Okay, it wasn't a group effort.
No, he wrote, the Second Amendment was the second out of the 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights.
Right.
He wrote all 10 amendments, including the Second Amendment. He probably had advisors like Jefferson, he probably bounced it off advisors. The way I personally think Madison winged it when he wrote that. It's just too brief,
Yeah.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but thanks for that. Okay, next,
Someone else had a question.
okay,
I recall a campaign, an ad campaign against chewing tobacco that was very graphic. I was working in a school at the time, and there were pictures of people who were victims of chewing tobacco. How do you feel about an ad campaign that is equally disturbing for the people who are going after ownership of guns?
Personally, I would be for that. I know that there's been discussion about that, but I'm not sure where we are with that. I do know that we're working on ad campaigns and possibly billboards for our Be Smart program, but nothing that graphic at this time from our organization.
you have another one?
Yes, in regards to gun violence as a public health issue, I believe that the Congress passed legislation that prevented the CDC from looking into it as a health issue. And segueing on the question that Pat just asked you, in terms of graphics on gun violence, one of the things that emergency doctors will tell you is the horrific damage that automatic gunfire does to bodies, not to mention what hollow point ammunition does. And making that illegal as a public health crisis, I think, is very legitimate. So the question really is, what can we do to try to influence the national legislation here?
I think as your organization or as a concerned citizen, the best thing to do is to call your United States representatives and senators and send them the postcards like your organization has gotten started for you. And we just have to let them know how we feel over and over again, because the personal stories are the ones that make things move, and we just have to keep doing that. We can't stop.
I make a follow-up.
Sure.
I just want to point out that I was in an elementary school, and the posters were in the nurse's office and in the teacher's lounge, and parents who came in would see those posters, and some people had chewing tobacco around, and it imprinted on their brain that perhaps their children would open their can and start it. Also, with the gun violence, it could imprint on parents' brains that maybe they should be locking up their guns. I mean, it would be totally appropriate for that segment of your campaign to get guns locked up.
Yes, we're working on that with different organizations in the Be Smart program. Part of the bill that was introduced by Representative Longden did talk about the Arizona Department of Health making up brochures to have in pediatric offices, but that, of course, didn't get a hearing.
Teresa, I'm going to introduce our next guest, but I hope you'll stick around because there could be some more questions after Thomas speaks, and he might even have some questions for you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Okay, so is that going to stay on while I'm talking? Is that good? That's fine. It doesn't matter. So I'm really thrilled to introduce the next guest. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching Nicole Wallace on MSNBC, as is my wont most days, when I want to really torture myself. And on that show, Fred Guttenberg who many of you know is a father who lost a daughter at Parkland, and is very ubiquitous in this fight, was on the air with a man named Thomas Gabor, and they co-wrote a new book that's just been released called American Carnage, picking up obviously from the ridiculous statement that our last president made at his inauguration, which almost made me want to put my fist through the TV screen when I heard it. Thomas Gabor is the president of a criminal justice consulting firm based in Florida and served as a professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa in Canada from 1981 to 2011. Dr. Gabor is now an international gun policy consultant and the co-author, as I mentioned, with Fred Guttenberg, of the recently released book, American Carnage, Shattering the Myths That Fuel Gun Violence. In 2016, Dr. Gabor had already published a book called Confronting Gun Violence in America, and has been a speaker at events sponsored by Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, March for Our Lives, and the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. I'm really thrilled and pleased to present Dr. Thomas Gabor to the DORR breakfast.
Thank you very much. And I'm assuming this was Stephen who had introduced me. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all,
The guy was sending you all those annoying emails.
well, I really appreciate this invitation. I want to say hello to all the Democrats of Arizona, the Red Rock area. I'm very fond of that area. It's great to be with you today. And I just want to say a few additional words about myself, just by way of background. I studied at Ohio State University. Originally grew up in Canada. I'm both a criminologist and sociologist. And in the early 90s, I was asked by the Department of Justice in Canada to do a review of this area, the research in this area, linking guns with violence. And I really had no axe to grind before then, but it really hit me that there was already a compelling body of evidence that showed that generally more guns equates to more violence, especially to more lethal violence, though obviously the relationship is more complex than that. But I was struck by the evidence at the time. I was also invited to participate as a consultant in the first United Nations study of gun regulation around the world. And that showed me just how much of an outlier the United States is in terms of failing to regulate guns as other countries do. I was furthermore, it was a career highlight, you might say. I was asked by the victims of the families of a shooting in an elementary school in Dunblane, Scotland, which was their version of Sandy Hook. 16 elementary school children were shot, as was a teacher. There was a subsequent national inquiry. I was asked to make a submission. And following that inquiry, the UK restricted handguns much more seriously. And they experienced a considerable reduction in gun violence after that. And as Stephen had mentioned, American Carnage is my 5th book on gun violence.
Wow.
Now, how did I get to work with Fred Guttenberg, who, as many of you know, and as Stephen mentioned, suffered the devastating loss of his 14-year-old daughter in the Parkland shooting? Well, I was working on American Carnage and examining the myths that are promoted by the gun lobby and gun extremists. And then the Parkland shooting happened. And you recall the March for Our Lives kids, they were all saying, we need solutions. So I put that book aside and wrote one called Enough. It was a book on solutions. And then I wrote a book called Carnage, dealing with mass shootings during the pandemic. It was my pandemic project. Then about 2 years ago, I reached out to Fred because we'd had some exchanges and he was getting more prominent in this area. and more vocal about trying to achieve some reform on a national level. And he joined the team, and we've collaborated ever since. And it's my honor to collaborate with him because he channeled his unimaginable grief to become a national leader in the gun violence prevention area. Now, with regard to American carnage, some of you, as Stephen has, may have seen us on television. We've started with book events this year, this week, I should say. We were down in Miami on Wednesday. Fred is speaking in New York City at a bookstore on this evening. But what I want to say, and I'm not boasting here, but at one point we were 34th. So this book was 34th across all categories of books in the United States. And for a gun violence book, that's very unusual to say the least, because it's not a self-help book. It's not a novel by some famous novelist. A lot of people don't want to read about this grim topic. And what it indicates to us is there's an increasing thirst in this country for action. And we've seen that in some recent polls as well. I want to get back to that in a few minutes. But in the last couple of weeks, we've had the opportunity to drop off a copy of this book to every member of Congress. We've addressed the House Democratic Caucus and briefed the White House. And as I say, we have a number of book signing events around the country. We've been honored to receive endorsements from Nicole Wallace of MSNBC, Representative Eric Swalwell, who is very active in this area, from California, even a talk show host, Joe Walsh, who was a Republican member of Congress, and many prominent academics. We're also honored to have a foreword written by NBA coach Steve Kerr of the Golden State Warriors. And he's got quite a story in this area. He's very passionate about gun violence, and his foreword is riveting. That alone, I think, is worth the price tag of the book. Now, why is he so passionate about the issue? Well, his father was president of American University in Beirut and was murdered by militants when he was a college freshman. So this is a very personal issue to him. And you may have seen the video that went viral maybe a year ago following the Uvalde shooting in Texas. And he was tired of all the vigils, tired of all the prayers, and showed his frustration on this video that went viral. Now, this book is about misinformation and how it fuels gun violence. We cover about 40 core myths that have been promoted by the gun lobby or extremists. I'll give you a few examples. We talk about how misinformation distorts the role of guns in American history. There is a general belief that guns were generally unregulated in US history. And nothing is further from the truth, whether we look at the Revolutionary period or we look at the banning of the carrying of concealed weapons in most of the states in the 1800s. So in fact, throughout American history, we've had some fairly significant gun regulation, and even in the West, even in your state in Tombstone, Arizona. And I'm sure you know that story, the gunfight at the OK Corral, better than I do. But in that case, Wyatt Earp and his brothers were enforcing a gun ordinance against an outlaw group called the Cowboys. So there were gun ordinances in many of the most notorious cities in the Old West. So much for the myth that expansion of gun rights today, say of carrying guns in the United States, is really an extreme measure relative to what existed in the past. Now, we also talk in the book about the myth that gun rights are unlimited, the myth that gun violence exists primarily in the inner cities, so the rest of us don't have to worry about it. And this is, in a way, to some degree, a racist trope as well. You know, that it's only happening over there in the inner cities, which, you know, are mostly have as residents people of color. Also, gun extremists exaggerate the frequency with which guns are used in self-defense. We also see a lot of deflection. There's what we call the mental illness dodge.
Yeah.
In reality, just 4% of all violence is committed by somebody with a serious mental illness. They also say that we don't need more gun laws, just better enforcement, while at the same time, the gun lobby, through its surrogates in Congress, has done its best to undermine enforcement by limiting inspections of gun dealers, by making it harder to convict dealers who are involved in some way or enabling gun trafficking. They've also limited the funds of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which is the federal enforcement agency. So, in fact, they've done everything they can to make it harder to enforce gun laws. But certainly, we take that on, and there are laws that we think would be very effective in this country, and which most Americans would support. Now, misinformation has consequences on the ground because the focus on the idea that we would be a safer society if all of us had a gun in our home and we all carried guns, certainly has been influential in convincing some Americans that this narrative is true, that more guns equates to a safer society. And of course, we know when we look at the international situation, international comparisons, the United States is an outlier in our very high rates of private gun ownership, but as well in terms of when we compare ourselves with other advanced countries, we have by far the highest gun homicide rates among other comparable countries. We are the only country that has as its #1 killer of young people up to age 19, gunfire. That's past car accidents in terms of the #1 killer of people between the ages of 1 and 19. But there are consequences on the ground of this, for what we call 40-year disinformation campaign that is trying to convince Americans they're safer with guns in their home, safer carrying guns, because this in fact leads to more individuals carrying guns and also leads to more individuals storing guns in an unsafe way in the home, which has numerous consequences. Now, and I know I don't want to take too much time before we go to Q&A. I just want to talk about a couple of slogans that we frequently hear about. And you've all heard this: guns don't kill, people do. And, you know, we see this almost daily in our social media interactions. We often hear people say, well, guns are inanimate. And you can also, they're inanimate objects, and you can also kill with knives, hammers, or even a frozen ham. Now, first of all, we provide considerable evidence that guns do facilitate homicide, and that an attack with a gun is far more likely to be lethal than an attack with a knife. And we also show evidence that guns facilitate mass murder. But, you know, if the weapon didn't matter, why don't we just equip the military with hammers and save billions? We can save billions on guns, tanks, and bombers.
Right.
And if the guns don't matter, why has the NRA lobbied for years, for decades, to make it easier to carry guns. People could just carry a frozen ham. So, you know, it's just absurd. And, you know, no less, I guess, no less a celebrity than Ozzy Osbourne once said, the musician once said, I keep hearing this about guns don't kill, people do. Then when there's a war, why don't we just send the people? You know, it's utterly absurd. And not only is there tremendous data showing that attacks and suicide attempts with guns are far more lethal than attacks using other weapons or fists. But certainly we need just to hear from the trauma surgeons to know the damage done, for example, by an AR-15, and that the laws of physics apply. So if I strike out at somebody with my fist, that hand is moving at probably 3 feet per second, whereas a handgun fires at about 700, 800, depending on the handgun, maybe 1,000 feet per second. And an AR-15 style rifle fires at about 3,000 feet per second. And so the higher velocity, it's not the only factor, but the higher velocity is one of the things that contributes to the utter devastation to the human body. These bullets fired at that speed and designed to tumble in the body, liquefy organs, literally, and create massive damage, internal damage that surgeons often simply can't deal with. Now, just mention another slogan, this issue about the gun violence is only a problem in the inner city. And I guess we've been witness to, all Americans, the last few weeks, these horrific incidents where somebody's knocked on the wrong door or gotten into a wrong car. And I've tried to do that multiple times in parking lots. So I think we can all relate to it, or turned into a wrong driveway and got shot or were shot at. And so I think we've seen the polling since then in the last few weeks. People are even more in support or supportive of the type of measures that most of us support. So I think some of those incidents, and they've happened in rapid succession, underscore to us that the problem exists in all corners of the country. And here's a statistic that is fairly recent. Kaiser Health, in its survey, found that 52% of Americans now have been personally affected by gun violence. They've either been intimidated by somebody with a gun, they've been shot, a family member has been shot, or they witnessed a shooting. 50% of Americans. So no, we can no longer say with any credibility that this is only happening in certain parts of the country with certain demographics. In fact, well, we know that mass shootings happen everywhere, and some of the most notorious shootings in the country, whether it's Sandy Hook, the Parkland shooting, Columbine, Aurora, and so many more. Sutherland Springs, Texas, the largest mass shooting inside a church in the United States. All of these happened in small towns or suburbs. So there's no credibility to the idea that this is just an urban problem. In fact, some data came out not long ago showing that of all the counties in the United States, 13 of the 20 counties with the highest gun homicide rates were rural. Right. Many of them in the South. Right. So this is once again a myth, which leads us to be complacent if we believe that this is not a concern in our communities. It's a concern in every community in the country. Now, I'd just like to end off with a hopeful message, and then be delighted to entertain your questions. I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. I know the Supreme Court is an impediment to change right now. also one of the parties, the two major parties in the United States, the GOP, and this is not a partisan message, but you're Democrats, I'm a Democrat, but the fact is that the GOP over the last 40 to 50 years has done everything to obstruct change in this area and to basically champion the interests of the industry and gun owners. And when I say this, we have no issue with gun owners. In fact, most gun owners are on board in this area in terms of wanting to see change. And even most rank and file NRA members want to agree that certain changes need to take place in the country. But, you know, back in Australia, which has many similarities to the United States, very strong gun lobby, frontier history, many gun owners, and so forth. And back in 1996, when they had their greatest mass shooting, 90% of Australians demanded change. So this was in a country with a long tradition of gun ownership and frontier living and so forth. And so I think one of the, and it was a conservative government at the time that just got into office and faced certain death threats, but still went through with effecting change because they knew that 90% of the country demanded it. Now, we're not quite there yet in the United States. However, a recent no less than Fox News poll, and many of you may have seen it, showed that 80% or more of Americans supported not just universal background checks, but red flag laws, raising the age for gun purchases and other measures. So the idea that we're hopelessly broken in this country and that change is utterly futile because you have 50% who don't want it is simply incorrect. Now, there are measures like assault weapons ban where it's less than 80%, there's less than 80% support. It's around 60% today. But we're getting to numbers now where we have a critical mass of Americans who support measures to do something. And we're seeing in places like Tennessee, such a conservative state, where the governor there, who's been adamant in his opposition to any change, now saying, well, we ought to convene a meeting, which they're going to do in August, from what I understand, and look at things like red flag laws. So we're starting to see movement in deep red states. So that's encouraging. We're seeing more gun sense candidates being elected in places like Tennessee and in Florida, where we have Maxwell Frost, the youngest member in Congress, 25 years of age, very eloquent young man, and gun violence is one of the areas that he prioritizes. We also see groups emerging of owners and non-owners working together to try to find some common solutions. Now, in American Carnage, we do lay out actions that average citizens can take. And the foremost action, in our view, is voting, but ensuring that our vote only goes to candidates who make firm commitments to support specific measures. So not platitudes saying that, where a candidate says, well, I'm going to focus on gun violence. That's simply not sufficient. We need them to make commitments to support certain measures, whether it's universal background checks, whether it's establishing a licensing system, which I truly believe needs to be done on a national level. The current background check system is deeply flawed. It's a 2-minute background check system. And it's the reason why people like the Parkland shooter was able to purchase his firearms. He was 18 at the time. Despite all kinds of disturbing signs that he was showing, he was able to purchase a firearm, an AR-15 style firearm, legally. And many shooters are purchasing firearms legally, even though they do show disturbing signs. So we need to support candidates who make firm commitments, because then we can hold their feet to the fire. We can hold them accountable and say, you promised to get this done, or you promised to support this bill. So if that becomes a priority, which we think is becoming an increasing priority to voters, that gun violence is one of the areas, abortion another, that is very much in the forefront of the consciousness of most Americans, then we're going to see things done. We're also seeing a number of states, Washington State passed an assault weapons ban, and I know that's going to be challenged. Nevada is getting certain measures done as well. So we're starting to see some movement on the ground, but the ballot box ultimately is where most of the action is, and we got to get Americans out there, because I don't know what the situation is in Arizona, but in the last election, we had 2.5 million Democrats who didn't go out to the polls in Florida. And so we have to do better than that. We have to motivate people. We have to get the ground game going and get the vote out. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to entertain your questions.
Thomas, this is Stephen. I'm gonna ask you the first question. To segue off what you were just talking about regarding voting. I'm of the belief, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room would agree with me and on Zoom would agree with me, that all the issues that we care about, whether it's gun violence prevention or pro-life issues or pro-choice issues, climate change, whatever it may, LGBT rights, are all inextricably linked to voting rights.
Absolutely.
Without the voting rights, it's very difficult to get this done, especially in red state legislatures. So my question is Fred also involved in that area in conjunction with his efforts with gun violence prevention? What exactly are you guys involved with in the voting rights area?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right that until the voter suppression that's happening in many states and the inequitable political system that favors rural districts and so forth in rural states, it becomes more challenging. I still think that you can only gerrymander so much. If 80% of your voters support Democratic candidates, there's a limit to what can be achieved through gerrymandering. But as far as what we're doing, we both try to get this message out about the importance of voting. And I know that Fred also has become recently involved in a group called the Just Majority, which is examining different ways to alter the Supreme Court and maybe change the numbers of judges in the Supreme Court. So he's more recently gotten involved in that. So we are very mindful of the fact that the electoral system and all the advantages enjoyed by the Republicans, basically, and then their further abuse of the political process, you might say, and through the drawing of maps and so forth, is a critical part of getting things done and those types of things that progressives want to see done, like gun reform, climate reform, addressing the climate crisis and so forth. However, we still believe that people shouldn't stay at home. It had devastating consequences in Florida. They should go out. We need a higher voter turnout in the country. And the last I saw, I look at 538 every day, and I'm sure some of you do, Nate Silver's site. Right. And they were talking about the fact that because of the demographic change in the United States, and because the base for the Republicans has become white voters without a college education, that number, those numbers, or number of that demographic group is shrinking very sharply. And so they need an extremely high voter turnout to keep winning elections. And we need, and we've done quite well at the national level the last few election cycles, and we need to have a low voter turnout for them to prevail. So still, even now, even with all the suppression and so forth that's going on, if we can get a high voter turnout. And I know that there are efforts by the new head of the Florida's Democratic Party to get that ground game going, then we can prevail even with all the impediments that are out there to voting. And then once we're in charge in a state, of course, there are many things we can do to make things more equitable. And I'll just add this, as somebody who grew up in Canada, that about 30, 40 years ago is when they introduced nationally their nonpartisan elections commission. And it's made a world of difference. And I believe every state should adopt that. I would like to see that happen nationally. It's so critical to ensuring that incumbents don't consolidate their power through the abuse of drawing the electoral maps.
Right. Shelley, let's start with a question or two from the Zoom group.
Sure. Actually, this was posted at the end of Teresa's speech, but I guess either Teresa or Thomas can answer this. Does the NRA still have as much power? Because I've heard their influence is waning.
Teresa, do you want to take that on? Or
Go ahead, Thomas.
I would just say this. They've had their own internal crisis and their issues of abuse of funds and so forth by the executives with the NRA, but they're still influential. However, it's not so much through their funding, but their ability to mobilize their membership. And, this gets to another issue. We're learning the NRA is not omnipotent. And this was one thing that many Americans commonly believed, we'll never, because of the gun lobby, they're so powerful, they'll never get any change done. But I'll tell you one fundamental difference between activists on the side of gun rights versus activists on the side of public safety, or some people use the word gun safety, is typically gun rights activists donate more money to campaigns. They're single issue voters. They call their members of Congress far more frequently. So they've been far more politically active than those who support public safety in general. And that's the gap that we need to narrow. We need to not necessarily be single issue voters, but not only do Democrats have to get out there, but they have to become more active in harassing their members of Congress, whether they're of the same party or the opposite party. Because at the end of the day, if there's sufficient pressure, even on the opposite party, many of these politicians are certainly susceptible to pressure because their number one concern is getting reelected. And we saw what happened in Tennessee, where the staunchly Republican-dominated legislature allowed these two young men back into the legislature. Pressure is what it's all about. Gun rights advocates tend to be much more active, much more vigorous, and in trying to influence their members of Congress, their state legislators, and folks now who are on the other side on this topic, on the side of gun safety, have to do likewise.
Right. Questions from the room? Anybody?
I've got one.
Okay.
Yeah, one question that I have, and it's basically related to some of the things that you were saying. A lot of people are involved single issue, and they tend to get motivated by emotion. Therefore, for gun rights, abortion restrictions, book banning, a whole host of wedge issues which the GOP has developed over decades. The ability to use advertising and other means of persuasion how do you motivate people who basically don't pay any attention to understand that when the one side motivates around one issue, they're all umbrellaed into these vast overreaches at state legislatures of things that most of the people don't want, but the legislature has the ability to do that. And so it's a really complicated issue for me, but it isn't just voting, it's how do you get the people who have been voted into office to be more receptive to a broader opinion base of their own electorate.
Yeah, well, yeah, it isn't just voting. And as I say, we outline a number of steps that the average citizen can take in relation to this particular issue. I'm sure there are lists that people can develop to deal with the other issues as well, that just don't necessarily involve the ballot, don't necessarily involve elections. But, you know, all I can say is it has to start at the ballot box. We have to prevail at the ballot box where we're in the position to change the landscape within the state and to change some of the rules, regulations, and access to the ballots and so forth. But there's a whole series of other things that can be done to make things more palatable, you might say. But there, you know, I keep emphasizing the importance of not viewing this as two sides. You're talking about a base of maybe 20% of the population that's, say, in the MAGA category, and that they tune in to different networks that we don't even have access to. When we do, by the way, we speak to them. If Fox News were to ask me to do an interview today, I would. And Fred did speak to Newsmax. I've been on far-right talk radio before, but that is not 50% of the population. In fact, I think it's important to remember that, yes, we have polarization in the country, but it's polarization with people more firmly entrenched, either on the right or on the left. And I'm not equating the two, by the way, but 42%, according to most recent polling, of the electorate is independent. And increasingly young people are registering as politically independent. So that segment of the population can be moved, can be shifted. And we've seen enormous shifts in public opinion in this area, in the gun violence area. So if it shifts one way to where more Americans now believe they're safer in their home if they have a gun, we can shift it the other way. And that's the purpose of this book, to influence the national conversation. So it's not 50% of the population that cannot be moved. I would agree that there's a segment that would be very difficult to influence, but that's more like 20% of the population.
Right. Thomas, we have another from the room here.
Yes, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm curious about all this talk. Makes me wonder if we are not creating what I would call a fear-based society, which really bothers me. This is never what American culture was about. And I wonder, I'm sure your research, that would be very difficult perhaps to get to, but this sense that everyone is so afraid of one another. I'm afraid of my neighbor. I don't trust people. That's not who we are.
Yeah, well, you know, that again, I put to some degree, at least on the doorstep of the gun lobby, because they've waged a 40-year campaign. If you look at advertising by the industry, you know, it's stoking fear. Fear is the fuel to gun sales. And this has increased in the last 20 years. And one of the statistics that Fred, my co-author, constantly mentions is that, first of all, when his daughter Jamie, who would be 20 years of age in July, was born back in 2003, there were 200 million firearms in the United States. Now we have over 400 million. Back in 2003, 2% of gun sales were AR-15 style guns. Now it's 25%. It's one of the most popular types of firearms. So there has been a lot of advertising that has gone into creating the situation, and it's all based on fear, including a lot of focus on women and trying to get women breaking through, because they already had, you know, the rural male individual. That was the traditional market for the gun lobby. So they tried to break through, beginning really in the 80s, because the National Rifle Association was taken over by a very extremist group in 1977 at one of their annual meetings. And they began, and the hunting was on the decline, sports shooting was on the decline. We no longer had a draft, which used to introduce young men to guns frequently. So they needed another way, and that way was pushing the fear, stoking the fear in the country, and emphasizing purchasing of guns for self-protection. And today, it used to be a very small percentage that bought guns for self-protection. Most people were getting guns for hunting. Hunting declined. Now it's 2/3 are buying guns for self-protection. So for example, we've seen they've broken through a little bit during the pandemic, because we've seen 7.5 million more new gun owners in the United States. Gun owners, not guns, tens of millions of guns were sold during the pandemic. It's declining a little bit now as the pandemic wanes. So the emphasis has been on self-protection. And so to answer your question, this has been the emphasis of the gun lobby for the last 40 years, to get people to fear your neighbor, to fear walking on the street, and emphasizing the importance of guns for self-protection. But what I find highly perverse, well, first of all, that has consequences on the ground. And we're seeing it in two ways. Number one, in the last 20 years, we see 5 times as many Americans, which translates to about 10 million Americans, now carry a gun daily or almost daily. Okay? Before, gun owners who just carried in certain circumstances. So you have 5 times as many carrying daily than in the past. And we also have almost half of gun owners now with a gun in the home are keeping it loaded and accessible. And that's what enables not only somebody who's in a rage to pick up a gun because it's around and it's loaded, but young people to get a hold of a gun and commit an impulsive suicide, or to take that gun and use it in the schools, because most school shooters get their guns at home or at home of a relative, or some child getting a hold of that gun and accidentally shooting himself or herself or a playmate. So there are all these consequences on the ground because of the fear, and because people now are buying for self-protection rather than for hunting and for these other purposes. So they're being handled in a more dangerous fashion because of that fear. And that's a big concern of mine.
Well, Thomas, we're out of time. I just wanted to thank you and also Teresa so much for doing this. The presentations were incredibly good. We learned a lot, and I really thank you I know you've been on the road and you just got home. Thank goodness for Twitter. I was able to contact you there. So I really appreciate what you did today.
Much appreciated. Thank you for having me. I am a little tired. I hope it didn't come across today, but be delighted to speak to your group and just keep that ground game going, because that's what we have to do in all the states. Thank you.
We will. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to spread the word about Moments to Demand Action and what we're doing.
Thomas, I'll email you.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
It used to be that
Bye-bye.
you could put Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Teresa. It used to be you could put two people on the screen at the same time. Apparently now Zoom has changed their rules. You can't have two people sharing the screen at the same time because it would have been nice to have Teresa come back and be on with us as well.
Recently.
Really?
Yeah, it was a recent change.
Thank you very
all
much.
for being here. What this sounded like to me is a challenge to us and groups like us. We have to keep going. We have to be active. We have to be loud. We have to let our people know, our legislators know how we feel. As part of DORR's mission to educate the community, we now publish a single issue newsletter called Keeping Posted. It was sent to everybody who was a DORR member. And we try to do a companion newsletter with the subject of the breakfast that's coming up this month. The Keeping Posted that came out last week was on gun violence prevention. It is written by a woman that is on, she helps the DORR board. Her name is Janine Reno. She loves doing research, and we try to tailor that newsletter to make it different than anything you can get anywhere else, different than what you read on MSNBC. We put things in that newsletter that pertain to the legislators that represent us in LD1, Legislative District 1 and Congressional District 2. Eli Crane is our, a CD2 rep. And then we have 3 legislators in the state legislature. The newsletters are on the Democrats of the Red Rocks website, democratsoftheredrocks.org. You can find them there. You can read them there. They're fascinating. And the more we educate ourselves, the more we motivate ourselves. Things like this makes me want to just get out there and do everything I can and make phone calls, send postcards. Chris, thanks for doing this. She's spreading these postcards far and wide. And we do what we can. It's really important. So thank everybody for being here today. We will have another breakfast the 3rd Friday of next month. It will be here June 16th. It will be on elections and election integrity. We've got a woman from something called Scrutineers. They do nothing but election integrity nationwide. And we also have Secretary of State Adrian Fontes live and in person. No. I'm sorry, not live and in person, live and on Zoom. Out of one person, but he would not like a video like we saw this morning, although was he not phenomenal? I mean, that was great. When you see all the training that the Marines have to do, amazing. So come next month, and Ronnie is baking a pie that we're auctioning off at the dance tomorrow night. Thank you, Ronnie. Yeah. And I did mention this earlier. We are having an auction. Who is that? The Dancing with the Dems tomorrow night, 7 p.m. at the Elks Club. There will be a wine auction, Ronnie's apple pie, and she's famous for this apple pie. We'll have a great time, so please join us. Thanks a lot.